Hi there, I'm Brother Merrill, and this is Sunshine for the Soul Inspirational Stories. It's been wonderful for me to have people from all over the world commenting. This morning I got a comment that was written in French and I had to use the auto translator. And this evening I got a comment from Australia. And I'm getting people from all over the world that have seen these stories and have been inspired by them. And it's thrilling for me to see that. And many of the people in their comments have told me they felt the Lord's love for them and they felt His Spirit. I've struggled with things on the internet and all the connectivity and Instagram and all the different TikToks and all of that stuff. I don't understand it. But I found on Facebook it's a lot easier to share things. So I've started a Facebook page. In the first comment, I'll pin a link to my new Facebook page for Sunshine for the Soul Inspirational Stories. It will allow all of you to share the videos that inspire you. And I will put a link to each video. So please pass these stories on and share the Facebook page link with people that you love. We all need to feel the Lord's love. Thank you. I have a great story today. I did an earlier video about Parley P. Pratt. And while he was in Toronto, he baptized another important figure in the restoration of the gospel. Mary Fielding and her parents and siblings were baptized into the church and immigrated to Kirtland. Mary lived in Kirtland for some time, and she grew to love and appreciate the leaders of the church and had a very powerful witness of the divinity of the gospel and had seen the prophet Joseph Smith and his family on many occasions and was very moved by what powerful good men they were. In October of 1837, Hyrum Smith's wife, Jerusha, passed away and left him with 5 children. Joseph was struck as he watched his brother languish and mourn the loss of his wife and tried to play a part in the restoration of the gospel and at the same time rear 5 children as a single parent. Joseph prayed about this and received a revelation that Hyrum was to marry Mary Fielding. She'd received many marriage proposals and she turned them down, and in several letters she expressed her adamant opposition into being a stepmother. She did receive a witness that the calling she had received to marry Hyrum from Joseph Smith was truly from the Lord, so she married him on December 24th, 1837. Not long after Hyrum Smith was imprisoned in Liberty Jail, Mary gave birth to their first son, Joseph Fielding Smith, and then she became deathly ill. During that time, her sister was nursing her back to health when they were driven from their homes and into Illinois. They moved to Quincy, Illinois to flee the mobs, and she was just clinging to life at the time. Finally, in the spring of 1838, Hyrum joined her again in Quincy, and they moved to Nauvoo. But this was not a peaceful time. The saints were under great persecution, and Hyrum and Joseph were repeatedly imprisoned. They were taken into custody and tried in various courts throughout the area. The last time he had seen her, they knew that it would be the last time that they saw each other in this life. On the day of June 28th, 1844, George D. Grant knocked on Mary's door. Brother Grant gave her the news that Hyrum was dead. She fell back into a bureau, and Brother Grant helped her into a chair, and she went into a deep mourning. I'd like to read what happened when Mary Smith and her children were allowed to view the bodies of the 2 fallen martyrs. She fell on Hyrum and said, "Oh, Hyrum, Hyrum, my dear Hyrum, are you dead? Oh, speak to me, my dear husband. I cannot think you are dead, my dear Hyrum." She drew him closer to her. She kissed his pale lips and face, put her hand on his brow, and pushed back his hair. The grief consumed her. But the death of Joseph and Hyrum didn't end the persecution of the saints. It just grew in intensity, and soon the LDS people were driven from their homes in Nauvoo. And Joseph Fielding Smith later records this of that experience. We left our home just as it was, our furniture and the fruit trees hanging full of rosy-cheeked peaches. We bid goodbye to the loved home that reminded us of our father everywhere we turned. We bid goodbye to our dear old feeble grandmother, Lucy Mack Smith. I can never forget the bitter tears she shed when she bid us goodbye for the last time in this life. She knew it would be the last time she would see her son's family. We crossed over the Mississippi River in the evening, and in that state they camped on the opposite bank of the Mississippi River. That night they heard the bombardment of Nauvoo as the mobs descended on the town. Mary had to leave her family camped on the banks of the Mississippi River, and she went down to Quincy, Illinois, and negotiated the sale of her property. And for her beautiful farm and the acreage that they had and the fruit trees and the orchards, she got several wagons, several teams, some cattle, and some horses. And with that, she returned to her family. She had to make several trips to secure provisions for the upcoming journey across the plains. On one of these occasions, Joseph Fielding Smith, her young son, accompanied her, and this is what he says happened. We usually unyoked our oxen and turned them loose to feed during our encampments at night. But this time, on account of the proximity of a herd of cattle, fearing that they might get mixed up and driven off with them, we turned our oxen out to feed in their yokes. The next morning, when we came to look them up, to our great disappointment, our best yoke of oxen was gone. Uncle Fielding, Mary's brother, and I spent all morning, well nigh unto noon, hunting for them, but to no avail. The grass was tall, and in the morning was wet with heavy dew. Tramping through the grass and through the woods and over the bluffs, we were soaked to the skin, fatigued, disheartened, and almost exhausted. In this pitiful plight, I was the first to return to our wagons, and as I approached, I saw my mother kneeling down in prayer. I halted for a moment, and then drew gently near her to hear her, pleading with the Lord not to suffer us to be left in this helpless condition, but to lead us to recover our lost team, that we might continue our travels in safety. When she arose from her knees, I was standing nearby. The first expression I caught upon her precious face was a lovely smile, which, discouraged as I was, gave me renewed hope and an assurance I had not felt before. During the time that they'd lived in Nauvoo, before Hyrum was martyred, they'd had Martha Ann. And after the death of her father, Martha Ann said she didn't ever remember her mother smiling ever again. So apparently to see this relief and this smile on Mary's face was quite renewing to Joseph Fielding. As Mary got up from her knees and smiled at her son, and she said, "Never mind me. Get your breakfast, and I will see." And she started towards the river, following down Spring Creek. Before she was out of speaking distance, the man in charge of the herd of beef cattle rode up on the opposite side of the creek and yelled out to my mother, "Madam, I saw your oxen over in that direction this morning, about daybreak," pointing in the opposite direction that she was going. She ignored him and then continued down the creek. I watched her every moment and was determined she would not get far out of my sight. We left our breakfast and I ran towards her. There I saw our oxen, fastened to a clump of willows growing in the bottom of a deep gulch, perfectly concealed from view. We were not long in releasing them from bondage and getting back to our camp, where the other cattle had been fastened to the wagon wheels all morning. We were soon on our way home rejoicing. The herdsmen suddenly departed when they saw my mother ignored them. I hope they went out in search of their honesty. No doubt those men had coveted that beautiful yoke of oxen and decided they would keep them for themselves. After securing supplies, Mary and her children made their way to winter quarters, and her 7-year-old son, Joseph Fielding Smith, was tasked with driving one of the teams. They got to winter quarters. Not only did she gather the supplies she needed, but she included other people who were not as prepared as herself. In those days, to be a widow was considered to be a burden on the community. After Hyrum's death, Heber J. Grant, in a polygamous marriage arrangement, gave Mary Fielding Smith his name. They never lived together, but that way she didn't have the cloud of being a stepmother and a widow. At the end of the summer of 1848, Heber J. Grant was arranging for the last company to leave from winter quarters and make their way to the valley. He wanted Mary to go with them, but they had several problems trying to gather all their equipment and keep their animals in check and to prepare. Crossing the plains was a horrendous task. And to put it in perspective, I'd like to tell the story of John R. Young. It was an unusually heavy immigration year, and he was called on a mission to participate in one of the wagon trains. Livestock was raised all over the territory, and then they would hook 4 yoke of cattle to a wagon and head back to Omaha, Nebraska, where they would pick up the luggage of the settlers, and everyone had to walk. When he got to Omaha, he was assigned to bring an independent company that had some of their own equipment to the valley. They were Danish. None of them spoke English, but one interpreter. And so he began to try to train these greenhorns. They had to learn how to drive the cattle. They had to learn how to yoke the cattle and connect them to the wagons, and how to steer and how to do everything. They were complete greenhorns. In the first few days out of Omaha, they only averaged about 5 miles a day. But within a couple of weeks, they were up to 25 miles a day. When they got to the western edge of civilization at Wood River, they received a telegram saying that the Sioux Indians were on the warpath. But they were promised a group of 5 Utah boys that were armed and mounted on horses and would be great people to help keep track of their stock and to guard their wagons during the Indian territories. They continued on their way, expecting the 5 men to catch them any day. And by the time they got to Ash Hollow, they'd gone 200 miles and had still not been joined by the 5 men who were meant to protect them. And they now found themselves in the heart of Sioux hunting territory. One night they were camped, and a group of U.S. cavalry were camped just on the other side of a creek from them, and they yelled across to them, "The devil's on the loose tonight, boys." And the next morning when they got up, the U.S. troops were gone, and so was the best ox that they had. It belonged to a Swede. To accommodate the company to continue, they found the largest cow they had, and they yoked it to the other ox. And then John Young rode back to find the ox, and he rode 25 miles before he found him. Getting to the end of daylight, he saw a dust cloud off in the distance, so he dropped down into a little ravine, and he hid the ox. And he climbed back up and got out a telescope, and he looked out, and he could see 4 Indians, and there was a little column of dust accompanying them as they drove a group of U.S. horses. And he knew then the reason why the 5 guards hadn't gotten to him. They couldn't apparently guard their own horses, and the Indians had taken them. It was getting the end of daylight, and he watched the Indians set up camp and hobble the horses, and he waited till it got completely dark, and the Indians had a large fire for Indians going that gave some light to the surroundings, and he was able to sneak in, cut the hobbles of the horses, and then carefully herd them out until they were moving away from the camp, and then he began to drive them with his horse, and they went to a full gallop. All he had was a pistol with him, and so he continued to flee from the Indians, but they were catching up to him, and so he took the horses down into the gully where the ox was, and then he waited. And he could see 2 of the Indians in darkness coming over the hill, so he fired off all 6 rounds from his pistol so that he would give them the impression there was more than one guy down there. And then he jumped on his horse and he drove those horses as fast as he could out, and he said it opened up into open country and he was able to make good time. And the moon came out and he said it was almost as bright as day. And as he was finally feeling a little peace that he'd gone far enough that the Indians weren't going to catch him, he began to hear wolves. And he said his blood just ran cold because wolf packs were vicious in that country. So he tried to herd the horses into an area where there was a little depression in a foothill off to the side, and he could hear the wolves getting closer and closer, and he didn't want to shoot one and injure it for fear that the blood would cause all the packs to just go into a feeding frenzy. But finally he had no choice. A big gray wolf ran up and was about to leap on him, and he shot him. The other wolves just devoured it. By that time he was completely surrounded by a group of wolves, and they were slowly closing in on him. And one of the ponies got excited and took off, and all the wolves turned and ran off towards that pony, and it didn't take long. They took him down. He saw his chance, and he rode through the night, got back to the camp with the immigrants at 4 o'clock in the morning. So that's the kind of adventure that people were having. And here's Widow Smith with all of her children, 7 children, and her brother, and a couple of other tag-alongs. She had 11 people in their group. She didn't get done in time to be with the friendly folks that she knew, and there was one man who was a little behind everybody else. He was going to take his own company, and that was Captain Cornelius P. Lott. And he had decided that he was going to be able to push on and really hurry, so she went to join his group. When Mary told Captain Lott that she was joining his company, he was obviously not happy about it, and he declared that she was unprepared and that she should just go back to winter quarters. And he really bit into her. Joseph Fielding said that his words cut deeply into his mother and hurt her. But she told Captain Lott that they would accompany them and that she would beat him to the valley. And he said, "You will be a burden to this company." And so the two of them had a very adversarial relationship. And they had several things that happened to them that were difficult on the journey. They had just about reached the midpoint of the journey when all of a sudden their best ox stiffened out, evidently in the throes of death. The death of this faithful animal would have been a fatal blow to the progress of Widow Smith to the valley. She knew this, and so did Captain Lott. Captain Lott came up and, seeing the cause of this disturbance, blustered out, "There, I told you you'd have to be helped and that you would be a burden to this company." But in this he was mistaken. Producing a bottle of consecrated oil, Widow Smith asked her brother and James Lawson if they would please administer to the ox, just as they would do to a sick person, for it was vital to her interest that this ox be restored, that she might pursue her journey. Her earnest plea was complied with. The brethren poured oil on the head of the animal and then laid their hands upon it and rebuked the power of the destroyer, just as they would have done if the animal had been a human being. Immediately the ox got up and within a few moments began pulling in a yoke again, as if nothing had happened. This was to the great astonishment of the whole company. Before the company had proceeded very far, another one of her oxen fell down as the first. But with the same treatment he also got up, and this was repeated a third time. So 3 of their oxen just coincidentally seemed to fall sick as if they had been poisoned by someone in the same morning. But by administration of the oil to the oxen they were all fully healed. This brought great chagrin to the countenance of Captain Lott. The guy's a little suspect in my book, just proving that the Lord does have a sense of humor. At the last crossing of the Sweetwater, 3 of Captain Lott's own oxen dropped dead, and he became a burden to the company. As they surveyed their position the last night, Captain Lott told them, "We're going to get up early in the morning. Everybody be ready to go. And we're going to get a full day, and we're going to go into the valley tomorrow." And the next day when they got up, one of their teams was missing. And they looked and looked. Joseph Fielding hitched up one of the teams, and he sat in his wagon and he watched as the company pulled ahead. The forward teams now had almost reached the summit of the hill, and I said to myself, true enough, we have come thus far, and we have been blessed, and not the slightest help from anyone has been asked by us. But the last promise seemed to now be impossible. The last hope of getting into the valley before the rest of the company was vanishing, in my opinion. And then all of a sudden, in less time than I'm taking to tell you, a dark, big, heavy cloud rose from the northwest, came over the mountains going directly southeast, and in a few minutes it burst in such terrific fury that the cattle could not face the storm. The captain was forced to direct the company to unhitch the teams, turn them loose, and block the wheels to keep the wagons from running back down the hill. The cattle fled before the storm, down into the entrance of Parley's Canyon from the park, and into and throughout the brush. Luckily, the storm lasted only a short time. As it ceased to rain and the wind ceased to blow, my brother John drove up with our lost cattle. We then hitched them to the wagon, and the question was asked by my uncle, Mary, what shall we do? Go on or wait for the company to gather up their teams? And she said, Joseph, they have not waited for us, and I see no necessity to wait for them. So we hitched up and rolled up the mountain, leaving the company behind. This was the 23rd day of September in 1848. President J. Reuben Clark told the story of To Them of the Last Wagon. It was reiterated in a recent conference talk by Brother Merrill. And I just thought a twist of this was as the young kids in the back of the wagon were going by, I think they kind of said, those were the ones in the last wagon. Anyway, we arrived at the old fort about 10 o'clock that Saturday night. The next morning in the Bowery, we had the privilege of listening to President Brigham Young and President Kimball and Erastus Snow, and some others gave some very excellent instructions. Then on the afternoon of that Sunday, we went out and met our friends coming into the valley, very dusty, very footsore, and very tired. So the prediction of Widow Smith was fulfilled, and she did beat Captain Lott and the rest of the company into the valley, and she was not a burden on them. I hope you've enjoyed this story today. I appreciate your comments. I appreciate the likes and the support I'm getting in the channel. Please pass the word on. And if you liked this story, you may find this one interesting. And a lot of people are watching all the stories. Here they are. Thanks again.